In 1978, a 23-year-old named Stephen Kabuki was attending a college called Hope University in Michigan. It was a small Christian school where he was studying German and history. Stephen was a little more free-spirited than the typical student enrolled at Hope University, which is very conservative. He was a big-time outdoor enthusiast, and he loved to go skiing. In February of 1978, which was just months before Stephen was set to graduate, he decided he wanted to go on a solo ski trip around the Lake Michigan area. This area was known as the Lake Michigan Triangle. It's also known as just the Michigan Triangle, and it's an awful lot like the Bermuda Triangle, which is in that northern section of the Atlantic Ocean where planes and boats have gone missing over the years, kind of inexplicably. Well, the Michigan Triangle is like that, and starting in the late 1800s, there were all these disappearances that started occurring in the Michigan Triangle area. Stephen was going to be skiing around the Lake Michigan area, and so he would be in the Michigan Triangle. Now, he had told his friends and his family that he was just going out for a day trip, and Stephen was a very accomplished outdoorsman, excellent cross-country skier, so really no one bats an eye when he decides to go out and, go skiing. No one even thought twice about it. They're like, all right, cool, we'll see you tomorrow. A day after Stephen had left for this ski trip, some snowmobilers were out in the Michigan Triangle area, and they spotted a trail of ski tracks that led up to the edge of the lake, where, at the edge of the lake, were a set of skis, and two ski poles just stopped abruptly. They see that this looks like someone might have fallen into the lake. Now, there weren't any clear breaks in the lake itself, but they figured it was worth telling police, and to at least let them know, in case they're looking for someone who might have gone missing in the area. And so, it was around this time that Stephen Kabuki's friends and family started to recognize that he wasn't back yet, and he should have been, and so they end up calling in an official missing persons report because he should have been back. And so, the two things happened in tandem. You have the snowmobilers that have found the ski poles and the skis, and you have the missing persons report that's come out for Stephen Kabuki, and immediately they're connected, and this massive search effort is launched with a focus on where those skis and the poles were found. Now, they looked everywhere, but it was like his tracks went right up to the edge of the lake and then just stopped. There weren't any more tracks on the lake. There were no breaks in the lake. There was nothing there. It was like he just suddenly either went into the ground or just vanished somehow. And so, as hundreds of people have descended on this area to look for Steve Kabuki, his backpack shows up right next to his skis and ski poles. That was the first place that everybody went, and his backpack wasn't there. They didn't really even know how to investigate it. It was just this weird phenomenon where all these people are like, I guess it just must have been there the whole time. They just didn't have a good answer for it. And so, after a long and very elaborate search, ultimately they had to call it off. And so, they told the family and friends that what must have happened is he got out of his skis and put everything down, went onto the lake, and it cracked, and he fell in. And so, that's what everybody believed. I mean, why wouldn't they? 15 months go by, and Stephen's father hears a knocking on the door. And who's at the door? Stephen Kabuki. And when he sees his son, he can't believe it, because he believed his son was dead. But Kabuki has no idea, Steve has no idea how much time has passed. He saw a newspaper in his father's house, and it showed that it had been 15 months since he disappeared. He asked his father, how can this be? And he told Stephen, you were near Lake Michigan. That's 700 miles away. How did you get here? And Step's like, I woke up in a field about 40 miles from here, and I went to, my aunt's house, your sister's house, and she brought me here. And no one had any idea how he got there, or why he was in the field in Pittsfield to begin with. In addition, Stephen had on clothes that he didn't recognize. He had a new backpack that had maps and all sorts of trinkets from different parts of the country. He had been to, apparently, San Francisco, Sacramento, all over California, to Chicago, to Utah. He's been all over the country, according to the things that are in his backpack. He had $40 in cash. He had new sneakers, new glasses, and he had a t-shirt on from a Wisconsin marathon. It says he was a participant in. And one of the only things that Stephen would say to the media, because he basically swore off the media and he didn't want to give a story to anybody, he just said to one of the news outlets that he felt like he had been doing a lot of running. But other than that, we don't know what he was doing for 15 months, and apparently he doesn't either. In early 2018, Danny Philippis was a 49-year-old firefighter living in Canada. He had a wife, he had 2 kids, he was happy, healthy, successful. And every year, he and his colleagues at the firehouse would go on a ski trip to New York, where they would go skiing at a mountain called Whiteface. And so, on the 7th of February, 2018, Danny and his 7 colleagues are at Whiteface. They're enjoying themselves. Danny was an avid skier-like. This is something he really looked forward to, was this annual retreat to Whiteface Mountain. And it was getting to be lunchtime, and his 7 colleagues said, "Hey, let's go down to the lodge and get a bite to eat." Danny was just having a great time on the mountain, and he was like, I'm going to just do a couple more runs. I'll meet you guys in about 30 minutes or so. I'm going to do a couple more runs before lunch. So they go down to the lodge, and Danny continues to do a couple more runs. And so, after an hour or so, and Danny still hasn't shown up at the lodge, his 7 colleagues have finished eating, and they're like, "You know what? I bet Danny just decided he wanted to skip lunch, and he's probably just fine." And so, they end up just going out and skiing the rest of the day. But by the end of the night, when the mountain is starting to shut down, they're all checking their phones for messages from Danny. They haven't gotten anything from him. They haven't seen him. They decide, let's go check out, his room back at the hotel and make sure that he's there. Maybe he got sick and he left, something like that. And the resort was attached to the mountain itself, so they just walked right over to his room. They knocked. He didn't answer. But then they went out back and they found his car, and his car was still there. They went to the front desk. They explained the situation. They ended up going in the room and checking to see if he was in there. He wasn't. But all of his personal belongings are still inside of the room. So Danny, who has not shown up after going skiing for this additional run, clearly hasn't left the mountain because his car is still here. His cash, his passport, everything is in his room. But no one knows where Danny is. And so they launched this massive search for Danny. And, this day, it was so crowded at Whiteface. There were so many people there. And also, it had snowed a ton before they even started skiing that day. So it would have been very difficult to move very far off the mountain, let's say, if someone wanted to. Just there was too much snow on the ground. So he couldn't have gotten very far. And there were lots of people there that they could interview to say, "Have you seen this man?" They had a picture of him, and no one had seen him. And there was no sign of him. Despite this massive search effort, no one has any idea what happened to him. The authorities call off the search, and they tell his loved ones and his friends that, Danny must have succumbed to the elements. That's the only explanation we can give. We can't find him now because the snow's pretty deep, but hopefully, when the weather warms up, we'll be able to launch another search and we can recover his body. And so, that's the news that's passed to his wife, to his kids, to his friends, and it's just devastating. And then, a couple days later, Danny's wife is home, trying to adjust to this awful new normal, and she gets a phone call from a number she doesn't recognize. And she picks it up, and it's a little bit hard to hear, but she immediately recognizes her husband's voice, and she can tell right away that there's something wrong. Like, he's not making sense. She's like, "Danny, is that you? Is that you?" And Danny's like, "I don't know where I am. I don't know how I got here. Where are you? What am I doing?" And so she immediately tells him, "You have to call the police. You have to call the police. They have to come get you." And finally, he agrees and he hangs up. The police receive a phone call from Danny, and he doesn't know where he is. He's saying that, "My wife told me to call you. I'm very confused. I don't know what's going on." And they ask him to describe where he is, and he starts describing what's around him. And police are able to, eventually pinpoint where he is. And it turns out he was near Sacramento, California, 2,900 miles away from Whiteface Mountain. Even more strangely, When the police go to collect Danny, he's still wearing his ski gear. Winter jacket, winter pants, ski boots on. He even still had his goggles on his head. And he has a haircut, has a fresh haircut. And he has a brand new phone, a brand new iPhone. But he had no money. He had no wallet. He had nothing. He had left all of his belongings in his room. So, looking at him, like, how did you get a new phone? How did you get a haircut? Why did you get a new haircut? And when you got your haircut, why didn't the person cutting your hair let someone know that a man who's visibly confused, wearing ski gear, is here getting a haircut in here? And so it's just a totally strange mystery that Danny, to this day, and anybody that knows Danny, his friends, the investigators, everybody, no one knows how he got there. How does a guy without a car, without any money, wearing ski gear, go from New York to Sacramento, California, somehow get a haircut and buy a new phone, and then just suddenly come to and be like, oh, that's right, I'm Danny, and I'm going to call my wife and let her know where I am now? Like, it was just crazy. So, this last story was documented in the official American Ethnology Report from 1897, 1898. Although the story is, well documented in this report, the location is unclear. People have speculated that it's either Ireland, Scotland, or Wales. So, just take this with a grain of salt, that the location is not known. It's an older story, but it was officially documented in an official report. In 1898, a 12-year-old boy was playing at this river that ran near his house. He was out in the forest. He was playing near this river, and he had a bow and arrow. And he was practicing shooting his bow and arrow. And after a little while, he got bored of his bow and arrow, and he went to the stream itself, and he started to build a little dam in the river to try to catch some fish. And as he's building this thing up, he's down on his knees, building up this little dam in the river. He notices someone is walking down. A man appears, walking out of the woods toward the river. He's wearing a sharp suit, nothing flashy, just clean and well put together. As he approaches, the boy looks up and sees that he looks like any ordinary man, just a normal stranger. The man walks over to where the boy is working and says, "Hey, what are you up to?" The boy replies, "I'm building a fish trap." The man chuckles and says, "That looks like a lot of work. Maybe you should take a break." The boy pauses for a moment, then says, "Yeah, maybe I could take a break." And the gentleman just says, "Well, if you want, while you're taking this break, you can come to my house. It's just up past the bend here. My family's there. You can have a meal with us, and then you can come back and you can finish your fish trap." And so, this is a different time. This is the late 1800s sand. I'm not suggesting that, at the time, it was totally cool to go with strangers into weird houses in the forest, but the boy felt compelled to say yes. He didn't want to be rude, and maybe his fear of strangers is less extreme than it is, for us today in 2020. And so he agrees to go with the man. They make their way up past the river into the forest a little bit, and they come up to this cabin. Now, the boy played in the woods here, and he had never seen this house before, but he's not too concerned, because as soon as he gets to the house, this cabin in the woods, he sees that the lights are on, and he hears kids playing inside. And a close family friend of his family's is sitting on the porch, talking to one of the other apparently family members of the stranger. And so the boy's put at ease, and he says hi to the family friend, and the family friend, waves back. The boy goes inside, and he sees that this family has a couple of kids roughly his age. They're playing, goofing around. They have dinner, this wonderful meal, and the boy, Wilfred, is like, "Man, this is so great." And after the meal, he lays down and falls asleep. He kind of loses track of time. The boy falls asleep at this cabin. And so he wakes up early the next morning, and he feels horrible, because he didn't mean to fall asleep, and he didn't tell anyone from his family where he was going. And he's thinking, man, they're going to be so worried about me. And so as he's getting up to leave, the stranger is already awake, the one that had met him down by the river and called him up to the house. and the boy says, "Hey, can you walk me down back to the river?" And the stranger's like, "I can take you part of the way down, sure." So the two of them, they're having small talk. And, the boy's thanking the man for his generosity. And so as they're walking, they're passing by an orchard on one side and a cornfield on the other. And it's this beautiful morning. The sun's just coming up, and the boy remembers thinking how beautiful the setting was. But he also was thinking I don't even know where I am right now. I'm assuming he's walking me back to where I live, but this doesn't look familiar at all. And the stranger stops. They get to almost a junction, right at the end of the orchard and of the cornfield. And the stranger tells the boy, Wilfred, he says, "Hey, just go straight. You're going to turn down this way, turn back, and you'll be at the river again, where we met." And the boy thanks the stranger. And the stranger turns and starts walking back towards his cabin and says, "Hey, good luck. See you." And the boy starts following the man's direction. And Wilfred, as he's walking, following the stranger's directions, he's suddenly curious and turns around to look back at this strange person who had brought him up to the house and then now brought him back. And he's stunned because suddenly the orchard and the cornfield are not there. Is no orchard or cornfield. It's just deep, dark forest. And he's like, "What's going on?" He turns back, and there's a search party. It looks like a search party running up to him. Part of the search party is the family friend that he had seen at the house. And the boy is, looking at these people running towards him, like they're running to him. And he recognizes the family friend. And he can tell they're, urgently looking for him. And he felt bad because he knows he slept over through the night, so he's like, "Hey, I'm here. And they're like, "Where have you been?" And the boy turns to the family friend, and he's like, "Didn't you tell them I was with you?" And the family friend is like, "What are you talking about?" And he's like, "Yeah, the house with the family. We ate dinner together last night." And the family friend is like, "I've been looking for you for the past several days. I've been with your family looking for you. You've been gone for 3 days." And the boy is like, "What?" And as he's describing the kind of general vicinity of where this cabin was, he's kind of pointing back up towards where it was and describing it from where the river was. The family says to him that, "Since you've been missing, we've heard rhythmic drumming non-stop coming from the section of the forest that you just described. We could never pinpoint where it was coming from. And now that you just showed up, the drumming has stopped." And so the kid's terrified, but there's no answers. Pretty creepy. So, 3 very strange stories that, luckily, all of them ended with the person being found again. But it doesn't change the fact that the mystery remains, where did they go? It's like they left the earth for a couple of days, sir, in Stephen Kabuki's case, for over a year and then came back. It was like a, glitch in the Matrix or something. And so I would love to hear in the comments what you think can possibly explain how these people are disappearing without a trace and then reappearing days, weeks, months, years later, not having any idea how they got there or what had happened to them. How can we possibly reconcile that? Very the same town, London, Ohio, which was a very rural small town in the middle of Ohio. They were high school sweethearts, and after high school, they would end up getting married. Fast forward 6 years, and Keith and Diane have been married for 6 years. They have a daughter named Raven, who's 4 years old, and Diane has just found this beautiful new home in London, Ohio, so same place they grew up, that was a little more isolated than any other properties they were looking at. It was still within London, Ohio, but it was in the forest. It was way off the beaten path, so to speak. But, Keith was a hunter, and he loved the forest, and, Diane loved the forest too. So they liked the idea of having that privacy and kind of living away from other people. So very quickly, they decide to buy the house, and they move in, and they kind of settle into their new routine. At this time, Keith was not only working full-time during the day as a welder, but at night he was taking night classes to prepare for this apprenticeship program he was trying to get into. Keith is gone 5 days a week for 12 hours at a stretch, leaving Diane home alone with Raven when she wasn't at school. And Diane was a stay-home mom, So she was at this house a lot. So, in those first couple of weeks that they had moved into this house, and Diane's getting used to being alone quite a bit, Diane, at night, would hear what sounded like something she described as scampering. Some animal is moving around outside of the house. And from time to time, she'd poke her head out. She had this big window that sat over the kitchen sink, so whenever she was doing dishes, she'd be looking directly into their forest in her backyard. And she'd poke her head out, and she'd try to get a glimpse of whatever it was. She just assumed it was, a deer or a dog or something like that. It wasn't a cause for concern, it was just something she noticed within those first couple of weeks. One night, after she had put Raven to bed and Keith was still out at night school, Diane was cleaning up the downstairs, and she was doing the dishes, and she was looking out the window, and she starts hearing that scampering sound. And as she's looking, she's got light behind her from inside the house, causing kind of a glare on the glass, so she's up close to the pane of glass, kind of peering out to try to catch a glimpse of this deer or dog or whatever it was. And as she's looking out into the tree line, which is very close to her house, there's only a separation of maybe 20 or 25 feet from the edge of her house to the edge of the forestand. As she's looking, she swears she sees a set of eyes looking back at her. And to her, it immediately confirms that that's a dog. There's a dog that's gotten loose, and that's what's been roaming around my property. She's not frightened. She's used to being out near the woods, so she's just like, okay, cool, it's a dog. And so she finishes the dishes, and she goes into the living room, which is on the other side of the house. And as she's picking up toys and moving things around, she happens to look up towards the window in their living room that's looking basically in the other direction as that window above her sink. She's looking in the opposite direction, and to her horror, there is a set of eyes that are at human level, that are right up against the glass. She only sees it for a second. She sees the reflection of the eyes before she backs away, startled, but there's light on in the room she's in, so she doesn't have a great view of what's outside. And she's not even sure if she actually saw those eyes. She's not sure if she's scaring herself. So she goes back into the kitchen to look out that window and see if she can see those eyes that she had seen before, that she believed belonged to a dog. She was hoping that they would be gone, and that would kind of account for the eyes she just saw at the living room window, even though it would have been a very tall dog. She goes into the kitchen. She starts leaning towards the window, and then, right as she's about to her head, almost against the glass ahead, comes right in front of her on the opposite side of the glass, with these glowing gold eyes looking right at her. She's horrified. She practically falls over, and she's looking up from the ground, and there's this face looking in the window directly at her. And she's scampering back, like on the ground, getting out of the kitchen. And right at that moment, she hears car tires out on the driveway, and it's Keith. Oh my God, Keith's going to run into somebody that's outside. She hears the door open, and she's just praying it's Keith. And sure enough, he calls out, and he sees her on the ground in the living room, and he's like, what's going on? And so she immediately tells him she definitely saw somebody outside. She thought it was a dog. Maybe it wasn't. And Keith, he's a hunter, He knows they're out in the woods. They've just moved into this house. He's thinking maybe my wife is actually a little bit scared to be so isolated out here. Keith goes outside with the flashlights looking all around. He's walking the property. He can't find tracks. He can't see anything. And so he comes back inside. And he never really believed that it was anything other than maybe her imagination or just some random animal outside. And so he's just telling her like, hey, I know we just moved in. I'm sure you're stressed. You're here alone all the time, You got this huge woods right next to our house. You're going to hear animals. I just wouldn't sweat it. It's probably nothing to worry about. She was not cool with being, told, don't worry about it, because she knows what she saw. So a month goes by, and Keith and Diane have stopped talking about whatever Diane saw. There wasn't anything else happening at the house. She wasn't seeing eyes or animals. Hearing any scampering sounds was just kind of back to normal. Keith is gone. He's going to night school, and Diane's home by herself. And she's in the kitchen. She's looking out that window. She doesn't hear any scampering or anything. And without any warning, she sees a set of eyes suddenly appear on the edge of the window, just outside of the woods. She sees the eyes dead on, and she backs up from the window. She's thinking to herself, I have to protect Raven. And her first thought is, turn off all the lights in the house, that way it can't see me. And so she runs around the house, terrified but knew she had to do it, turning off every light. The last light she turns off is the living room light, and she's up against the wall. And as she hits the light in the living room, making everything dark, she suddenly gets a clear picture out that living room window where she had seen the eyes as well. The month earlier, and standing pressed against the glass, is Anis, an absolute human figure, with eyes at human level, these orange glowing eyes at eye level, standing right against her window, looking in the window directly at her. Horrified, she starts making her way into the kitchen by sliding up against the wall. They have a landline phone that was hung in the kitchen, and so she gets to the phone, trying to keep an eye on that back window. She can see the side of this thing's silhouette she calls 9-1-1 and says, there's someone outside my house. They won't go away. As soon as she hangs up, from her perspective, she can only see its shoulder. She watched the shoulder disappear out of her view. She poked her head back in the living room, and sure enough, it's gone. And as she's sitting there, it's silent. There's no sound in the house. She can hear clear scampering sounds, like running sounds, outside of her house as this thing is running all the way around her house. And she's sitting there wondering if this thing's going to break a window to come inside. What would she even do? And so finally she sees the flashing lights of a cop car pulling into the driveway, and she hears the police knock at the door. She runs to the door, opens it up, and she's hysterical. And the police are trying to calm her down, to just get the story of what's going on. And she's pointing out, saying there's something out there. And the police start looking around the property. Keith comes home, and he knows instinctively what's probably happened because the police are scanning the property for something, and he's thinking, she saw this thing again. Whatever it is, probably was just a reflection of herself in the glass, and now she's called the police. This is a small town. Keith is worried that people are going to think he's crazy. And so Edith comes in, and he regretted this, but he immediately got mad at his wife, like, what are you doing? Like, you're calling the cops? Like, there's nothing here. I looked last time. They're looking now. And they were even saying, like, we haven't seen anything. We're going to look for a little bit longer, but there's no sign of anybody being here. And at some point, the police are like, yep, we didn't find anything. And the police are like, let us know if anything else happens. And they leave. Keith and Diane are left just fighting. So 4 months go by without incident. There's no scampering outside, there's no eyes in the windows, and Keith and Diane have kind of moved past that whole ordeal. And they're, back to normal. They're really not even thinking about it. And even Diane would say, like, I did begin to believe that it was just in my imagination, and that I was just stressed and maybe overwhelmed at how often I was alone in that house. And it was just getting to me. And 4 months go by. It's early December of 1981, and it was the first big snowfall of the winter. And Keith wakes up one morning after the snowfall. There are a few inches on the ground, and he decides, because his family's still sleeping, that he's going to go out and he's going to get donuts and bring them back for the family donuts and coffee. So it's still dark outside. He goes outside, starts up his car. He's rubbing his eyes. He's still tired. He's adjusting his rear view mirror, and when he stops it for a second and he's looking up there, he thinks he sees somebody standing behind his car. What? And he readjusts it, and he looks, and it's gone. And so he throws the car in park, grabs his flashlight, and he starts looking around because he knows he just saw someone standing behind his car. And so he's walking around, shining his light, and he's realizing the irony of this situation. This is the same situation that his wife was in, believing she saw somebody outside their house, looking for it. It's nowhere to be found. He just saw someone standing, saw the eyes of a person, standing behind his vehicle, can't find this person. And he's thinking, was there any truth in what she saw? Was I wrong? And so he's looking everywhere, and all of a sudden he sees tracks. He can't tell what kind of tracks they are, but there's clear prints in the snow. It was fresh snow. He knows where he had been walking, and he starts following them, thinking he's going to get to either a person or he doesn't know what. And he sees they stop right next to his house, and he's looking like, where could they have gone? And then he looks up to there was a first floor section of the house that was a little bit extended. So there was a roof that was at the first floor level, and then there was the rest of the house that was at the second floor level. And he sees that the footsteps go from the ground to the first floor roof, and then they go up to the second floor roof, and they go over to the other side of the house. Who's doing this? What's doing this? And so he starts going to the other side of the house, and he can't see any more prints. And he's looking up at the top of his house, and he's thinking, am I going crazy? Something's on my house. Like, what's going on? And so he goes inside and he calls his hunting buddy Dennis, who's the only person that lives relatively close to them. And he's like, you got to come over here right now. I got something weird going on. I think someone's stalking my house. I can't be sure. You got to come over here. Dennis is like, I'll be there in a minute. When Dennis gets there, Keith's outside with his rifle. And Dennis is like, what are you doing? And he's like, somebody. And he shows him. The prints jumped on my roof. Someone's on my roof. I don't know what's going on, but someone I think is on my roof. And as they're talking about it, they hear what sounds like thump something just landed really hard from a pretty high distance, and it was on the other side of the house. They kind of run around, rifle, and Dennis had his rifle too. They go to the other side, and they see like 2 clear footprints but 20 feet away from the edge of the house. Meaning, this thing on the roof, if it jumped off. It jumped not only 2 stories to the ground, but it jumped 20 feet out away from the house as well, because there were no other footprints, and they just heard it land and it ran off into the forest. And so Dennis and Keith look at each other, and Dennis is like, what do you want to do? And Keith's like, let's go after it. Now Dennis and Keith, they hunt in these woods all the time, and they see right away that the footprints, the tracks of this person or creature or whatever it is, they're about 14 inches long, and it appears to be a bipedal creature. It does not appear to be on 4 legs. Something's moving on 2 legs. And they're thinking about just how would this person be able to get on the roof? What animal runs around that has a 14-inch track that runs on 2 legs? Like, they're not really sure what to make of it. Is it a person? Is it a creature? We don't know. And so they follow the tracks into the woods, and the whole time they have this awful sensation that something's watching them. And from time to time, they would hear something ways away from them that sounded like a big animal moving in the forest, but they could never quite get to it in time. And at some point, they started hearing noises behind them, and they're thinking like, is it possible that this thing has run ahead of us and then looped back around and is now tracking us? Like, they were feeling really uncomfortable. And as they're about to just kind of abandon this search because they've been looking for this thing for hours, they keep following its tracks. They get to a clearing, and they find this tiny cabin that neither of them had seen before, right in the middle of the clearing. And they see that these tracks lead right up to it. And they follow the tracks up to the cabin end. The tracks stop right outside the door. There's one door leading into this cabin, and the door is shut. And they're thinking, like, what animal can open and shut doors? And so Dennis starts immediately hitting on the door, trying to get this person to come outside and show themselves. We know you were over at Keith's property. Get out here. We followed you here. We know it's you. There's no sound inside. There's no movement inside. They're looking in the windows. There's nothing. Realizes, like, it's a bad look for us to have tracked this person to their house. We have guns, like, this is a bad look for us. We can't be here. We need to leave and just let this go. They have a couple more choice words, and then they leave. And they decide, instead of going back through the woods, they go to the nearest road that they could hear nearby. They go to the road, and they go to a payphone. They call Keith's father, who comes to pick them up. And when they hop in the car, Keith's dad is like, why do you have guns? And Keith and Dennis explain what happened, and they describe this cabin in the woods that they were just at. And Keith's dad is like, oh, I know who lives in that cabin. It's this guy who works at the tire shop. He's a loner type guy, older guy. No one really knows much about him. So Dennis is like, we got to go to that tire shop. I want to get a look at this guy. Keith's a little bit unsure like. He doesn't want to blow this out of proportion. But they ultimately decide that they're going to bring a beat-up tire to this tire shop and ask to get it repaired to try to get a look at this person who apparently owns the cabin. So they go to this tire shop. They know that the front desk attendant is not the guy who owns the cabinets, the actual mechanic who's in back. And so they give the tire over, and the front desk guy yells back to George, says, "Hey George, come out here, you got a tire." And so Keith would describe George coming out of the shadows to get the tire. And he's like this 6'5", older guy who looks up at Keith and Dennis, and he's got these orange eyes. Keith would say it was the most distinctive set of eyes he'd ever seen. And he looks up at them, and George has a moment of recognition, that he's looking at the two men that just tracked him to his house. And Dennis and Keith are looking at him, thinking, "We know it was you." And they both recognize it. George looks down, walks away with the tire, and then when he finishes whatever he's doing with the tire, he rolls it out to the middle of the floor to stay in the shadows. Keith and Dennis are like, he didn't want to show himself again. He knows that we know he's the guy. Dennis and Keith leave and think, man, like, that's so weird. He's an old guy. I mean, he kind of fits the description, I guess. You know, he's a big guy, 14-inch tracks that could be him. But none of it really added up. I mean, he's an older guy. How's he getting on the roof? Keith is like, I can't tell police what happened because I would have to admit that I stalked him to his house with a gun. That's how I know he's there. And he didn't commit a crime, at least. I can't pin him to a crime. And so he can't tell the police. He doesn't want to tell his wife because his wife not only would have a big told you so, Momenta knew that she would immediately want to leave, like move. And he did not have the financial resources to move. And so he decides to just kind of keep it to himself and hope that he does not run into George again. So for a few months, there's no sightings of anything strange happening at their house, at Keith and Diane's house. But in March of 1982, 3 months after their encounter with George at the tire shop, Dennis shows up at Keith's house, and he says, "Hey, get in, I want to show you something." And so Keith gets in Dennis's car, and they start driving. And Keith can tell that Dennis is taking him towards this cabin in the woods where George lives. And Keith says to Dennis, "We can't do this. We cannot go to this guy's house. We know he did it. But what are we going to do?" And Dennis goes, "No, I just found out that George died. He's dead. So we can just go check it out right now. We can go check out his residence." And Keith is like, "I feel bad about it, but okay, let's go check it out." And so they start driving down this one access road that would lead to George's cabin, and they find a cop car is sitting in the middle of the road. It would turn out that Dennis knew the cop, and he explained the whole strangeness behind this cabin and how it related to them. And the cop at first was very reluctant to give any information about why he was there or what was going on at the cabin. But ultimately, he relented and said, "Actually, I'm here because there's something strange with the cabin. We don't really know what to make of it. And, if you want to, I can give you a quick peek of what the cabin looks like." Keith and Dennis are like super intrigued, and they're like, "Okay." And so they go into this cabin, and there's nothing in it. There's basically a chair and a table, but that's it. There's no personal effects. There's no food. There's nothing. It's just this empty, tiny space. And Keith and Dennis are, shocked. They're like, wow, this guy was living like a hermit, basically. And they thought that that was what the cop was referring to when he said, "There's some weirdness with this cabin." They're like, "Man, that's crazy, George, how did he live like this for 40 years? Crazy." And the cop's like, "No, that's not the weird part." He goes, "That's the weird part." And he points at a sheet that's hanging down inside of the cabin. The cop goes over and pulls the sheet aside, and it revealed a metal door-sliding door. And they slid it open, and immediately they're hit with this wet dog smell, like kind of a gross wet dog smell. And they go into this cell that had plate steel lining the walls, with metal strips and rivets holding everything in place. It was like this metal-encased tomb that they were in. And in the middle of the floor was a 10-foot chain link. And at the end, There were shackles for wrists and for feet, and on the wall were all these scratch marks, old and new, all over the walls. And so the police officer's like, yeah, we're trying to figure out what old George was doing with this cell in his cabin in the middle of the woods. Keith and Dennis, they leave, and they go back into their car, and they're driving away, and neither of them are even talking about what they saw. But they know that something that was being held in that cage in the cabin had been the thing they had stalked. It had been the thing that had been stalking their property, Keith's property. It was the thing that was staring in the windows. It's all very unsettling, but Keith, Dennis, and Diane never found out what it was. Keith would say, though, that there was no more stalking at his property once George had died. They never saw the eyes again. So, no matter what this was, something had been showing up at Keith and Diane's house, looking in the windows, stalking them. And something made tracks, got on the roof of Keith and Diane's house, ran into the woods, and made its way back to George's cabin. Now, we don't know if that something was just George, or if it was some creature, some animal that was in that cage, or if it was something else entirely. Let me know in the comments, what do you think it was? On the 30th of January, 1925, a 37-year-old man named Floyd Collins walked through this huge forest in central Kentucky, inside of a national park. As he walked along, his boots splashed in the melting snow and mud on the ground, and above him, all he heard was the sound of water dripping down amongst the leaves. It was warmer than it had been in several days, and so that was why Floyd was out here. He was trying to take advantage of the nice weather. After walking for a while on this muddy, slushy trail, the trees around Floyd began to thin out. Eventually, he reached the edge of the tree line, and in front of him was this huge clearing. Now, in this clearing, the trail he was on continued straight ahead, but it came to a stop in front of this huge cavern-like opening in the side of a hill. Without hesitation, Floyd stepped out of the trees into the sunlight, and he walked the rest of the trail right up to the opening of this cavern, and he stopped and just stared and smiled. This cavern-like space on the side of this hill was the entrance to a cave known as Sand Cave, and Floyd had spent the last week coming out to Sand Cave and exploring the different tunnels. Today, his plan was to go as deep and as far inside of this cave as he possibly could. Caves were a huge tourist attraction in this region, and Floyd was a very experienced caver who had been caving since he was 6 years old. He knew that most of Sand Cave had not been explored, and so if he could go in there and explore all the different parts of the cave, map it all out, and make sure it was safe, it was sure to be a huge moneymaker. He could bring people here and lead them on guided tours. So Floyd left the muddy path he had been walking on and stepped foot inside of this grand entrance to Sand Cave. It's basically this 250-foot width cathedral-like space inside of this hill, with ceilings high enough you could stand. But it's totally dark in there, and despite being this big open space, it very quickly funnels to this one kind of tunnel that goes straight down and connects to all these offshoot underground passageways, many of which have never been explored before. As Floyd walked across this big open entryway, he lit his oil lamp and then began mentally preparing himself for what he was about to do, which was going to be very claustrophobia-inducing even for a very experienced caver. Floyd reached the back of this huge entryway and reached this tunnel that would connect to the rest of the cave, and he began walking down it. This tunnel was not very restricting. You could stand in it, you could move around in it, but it was very short. It was 15 feet straight down at an angle, where at the bottom of those 15 feet was a square hole in the ground. Floyd, having been here the previous week, knew that once you go through this hole, the real caving begins. Now, you're going to be down on your hands and knees, wriggling your way through these very tight and restricting areas where you don't really know where you're going because, again, a lot of this stuff has never been explored before. But this is why Floyd loved caving, loved the adventure and the risk of doing things like this. And so, Floyd got to this hole. He put his oil lamp down on the ground, and he casually lowered himself feet first into this hole, which dropped down several feet. Then, once he was on firm ground, he reached up, grabbed his oil lamp, and pulled it into the hole with him. Once he was inside of this lower level space, he crouched down and looked around, and off to his right was a tunnel that he could crawl through that seemed to lead to a series of other tunnels. So he puts his lamp in front of him, he gets down, and he begins crawling through this tunnel, and after a little while, he reaches this kind of fork in the road where he had several options of very narrow tunnels to choose from. Now, the previous week, Floyd had gone down several of these tunnels and mapped out where they went, but there was one tunnel in particular at this fork that was very narrow. It was likely the most narrow of all the tunnels, but from where he had seen the last week, it looked like it went pretty far without obstruction, and so he immediately began going headfirst into this tunnel where he had no idea where it was going to go. Think about that. If you go headfirst into a tunnel and you get stuck, what are you going to do? You can't really go anywhere. So this guy is like totally fearless, just going headfirst into what most people would consider a nightmare scenario. And so the way Floyd would approach these very tight tunnels is he would put his oil lamp out in front of him, and then he'd keep his hands over his head, and he'd kind of wriggle his way head first and push his lamp along the way. And so that's what he did. He began going into this really restrictive tunnel. You know, it's hard to breathe because the walls are so tight on his chest cavity, but as he's going, eventually the ceiling begins to slope upward just enough that he can pull himself up onto his hands and knees and kind of catch his breath. By this point, Floyd was approximately 55 feet underground. That's where this little pocket was where he could get up on his hands and knees and breathe. And so, from this position, he still could see with his lamp that this tunnel continued to snake further and further down, and his hope was that eventually it would lead to a big underground chamber that was not just big enough to go to your hands and knees in, but was big enough you could stand and walk around in. Because those were the big tourist attractions, not only because it seems like another world underground that you can fully explore and walk around in, but also, as Floyd knew from his past experience of going into other caves, a lot of times those big underground chambers are full of Native American artifacts. And again, that was a huge potential moneymaker for people like Floyd, because it allowed him to advertise that this cave, where tourists could go explore, was full of all this rich history. And so, Floyd eventually, after catching his breath in this little spot, got back down onto his stomach with his hands out in front of him, with the lamp out ahead of his fingers, and he began going deeper and deeper into this unexplored section of sand cave. And as he inched along, even though the ceiling remained very tight on top of him, he's totally compressed to the ground. The walls on either side of him began to expand, which meant Floyd, if he wanted to, could actually turn himself around, although he couldn't stand up. And so, Floyd is making his way down this very low ceiling area when he notices his oil lamp is beginning to flicker, which means it's going to go out soon. Now, Floyd wasn't concerned about suddenly being in the darkness inside of a cave. To most people, that would be terrifying. But Floyd, again, was so experienced. He was very confident that he could easily make his way out again just by touch. He didn't need the light. But he did know that trying to move around inside of a cave in the darkness was dangerous, and so he should not do that if he could avoid it. And so, as much as Floyd wanted to continue and hopefully find something incredible inside of this cave, he just decided he really needed to just turn around and go back to the surface and come back the next day to continue exploring. And so, because this part of the tunnel he was in was really wide, he was able to turn himself around and drag his lamp until he was facing back uphill. And then he rolled onto his back, so his head is pointing back up where he came from, and his feet are pointing in the direction that he had previously been traveling. And he's on his back, and so his oil lamp is above his head. He can move his arms side to side because, again, it's pretty wide in the area he's in, but his head is pretty restricted by the ceiling. And he began inching with his heels and pushing with his arms, moving up the tunnel on his back. And as he would move, he'd use his head and his hands to push the oil lamp back up the direction he was going. And for a little while, this system worked great. But at some point, right as he was getting close to that area where he was able to previously get on his hands and knees and catch his breath, Floyd accidentally kind of rushed and pushed his lamp too hard and knocked it over, which extinguished the light. And so, suddenly, Floyd was cast into total darkness. Now, again, Floyd was not concerned, or really even scared about being in darkness inside of this cave, but this was not a good scenario, and he knew it. But he told himself, stay calm. He knew where he was in the cave. He just needed to get to that little pocket. He'd catch his breath, and then he'd continue his way back up. Eventually reach that hole in the ceiling, that square hole. He'd climb out, make his way out of the cave, and boom, he'd be done. And so, Floyd just continued to push the now extinguished oil lamp above his head, and he continued to inch with his heels and moved his arms around to keep going backwards up this tunnel. But then, right before Floyd reached that pocket inside of the tunnel, where he could get onto his hands and knees, he heard the sound of falling rock somewhere below him, kind of near his legs. Now it's pitch black. He can't see anything. And so Floyd just kind of held his breath and hoped that whatever was happening wouldn't affect him. But then he felt a shooting pain in his left leg. A 27-pound rock had broken loose from the lowest ceiling and landed on his left ankle. Now, at first, Floyd was actually relieved that the rock had landed only on his left leg. In fact, his leg was actually kind of positioned in a depression on the floor of the cave, and so the rock didn't really hit his left ankle directly. It kind of hit the ground and then leaned onto his left ankle, and his left ankle was kind of protected in the depression in the cave floor. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness it only landed on my ankle and not on my head or my chest, because then he'd be dead. And so, after catching his breath and kind of calming down, Floyd tensed his body and pulled his left leg as hard as he could to clear this 27-pound rock, but his foot wouldn't budge. And so, Floyd thought he would just reach down and kind of dig his foot out, just move the rock out of the way. But even though this cave had widened out on either side of Floyd when he had gone deeper and deeper into it, because he had retraced his steps, he was farther up the tunnel, where those sides had really come in much closer to him. And so, he wasn't able to actually reach down and touch the rock. The walls made it impossible. And so, he wasn't able to use his hands to clear this rock. And so, Floyd is pinned underground, unable to move, in absolute pitch darkness inside of a cave that's practically crushing his chest because the ceiling is so low. And he knows it's unstable. The ceiling has now fallen off, so there's a chance more rocks could come in at any time. I mean, this is like a worst-case scenario for anybody who goes caving. But Floyd told himself to just stay calm. He knew this was a very bad situation, but people were certain to find out he was missing. And they knew he had gone to Sand Cave, and they would come here. They would find him, and they would rescue him. And so Floyd just decided he would wait. And for an agonizing 30 hours, remember, 30 hours of pitch blackness, trapped in a totally claustrophobic environment. 30 hours of this, no food, no water, can't go to the bathroom. He's laying there for 30 hours. And then, finally, he hears a voice coming from somewhere near the entrance of this cave. And when he heard that voice, it was like the sweetest sound he had ever heard. Because not only did they represent help, but the voice was coming from Floyd's brother, Homer, who was also a very experienced caver. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness I'm saved. And so Homer was able to navigate from the entrance down all the way to the tunnel that Floyd was in, and Homer got to that spot in the tunnel where Floyd had gone to his hands and knees, that pocket there. So Homer's in that pocket, and he can see Floyd is only a few feet away from him. He can see Floyd's head right there. And so Homer, who had a lamp, shines the light on Floyd. And the two brothers don't waste any time with small talk. Instead, Homer, who had his oil lamp, set it up right next to them, and he began feeding Floyd sausage sandwiches and giving him sips of water. And then Homer would tell Floyd that he just did not have the equipment to help Floyd get out right now. But Homer was going to go back to the surface, get men, get supplies, and then come back and save Floyd. And so Floyd is very thankful. He's very relieved. He says goodbye to Homer, and Homer returns and makes his way back up to the surface. 15 hours later, Homer would return by himself. And so at this point, Floyd has been trapped for 45 hours. And so Floyd is laying there, kind of in and out of consciousness, and he hears the sound of Homer calling out to him. And then he hears the sound of Homer chiseling away at some rocks. It would turn out Homer's plan to save Floyd was basically to chisel away the side of this section of tunnel that Floyd was stuck in order to be able to reach down and somehow, some way, clear the rock off of Floyd's leg and then pull Floyd up. Now, Floyd understood, of course, that this plan of chiseling away the side of this tunnel to make it wider was going to take some time. But luckily, Homer had shown up with more food and water, and they chatted the whole time as Homer worked. And so Floyd was in good spirits, and Homer was very optimistic. But after 8 hours of Homer slowly chiseling his way, widening this tunnel, he hadn't made much progress, and he was totally exhausted. I mean, you gotta remember that the angle he was working at was horrible. He was basically crouched down on his hands and knees, chipping away at this rock. And so, after those 8 hours, Homer would leave Floyd and go back home to sleep, eat, drink, and recover. But he told Floyd, "Don't worry. Tomorrow, more men will be here to help chisel away this tunnel and get you out of there." But over the course of the next 50 hours, Floyd remained trapped inside the tunnel, with the rock still pinning his leg. And despite Homer and several other men getting down there and diligently chipping away at the tunnel, it just was not happening very quickly. Over the course of those 50 hours, Floyd began going in and out of consciousness. He started to lose his grip on reality and couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. At one point, he claimed he believed the cave had opened up and angels riding golden chariots with flaming wheels had come to save him. As they were lifting him out of the cave, he said he smelled food and coffee. And then suddenly, the hallucination cleared and he realized he was still trapped in the darkness, all alone. The realization crushed his morale. Floyd was really starting to go downhill, and the rescuers were realizing they needed to act and fast. But at the 130-hour mark, things got even worse. Floyd was laying there in the tunnel. It was sometime in the middle of the night, and no rescuers were actively down there with him. He was listening to the sound of running water somewhere outside the cave, the sound echoing and amplified through the stone. Then, all of a sudden, he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere above, and when those rocks stopped, and it went quiet again, he could no longer hear the running water. It was very muffled. That was when he realized there must have been a cave-in somewhere higher up. That meant there could now be a total blockage just to reach him. Forget about widening the tunnel, they might not even be able to get to him anymore. Floyd did the only thing he could do. He prayed. The cave-in had in fact sealed off the tunnel and made it impossible to reach Floyd through the original path. And because of how extensive it was, the rescuers decided to start carving a brand new tunnel that would join up with the side of Floyd's tunnel. This was an even bigger undertaking than their original plan, and that plan alone had already taken several days. Finally, on the 16th of February, 1925, a staggering 17 days after Floyd had first gotten stuck in the Kvetha rescue team punched through and reached him. But as soon as they did, the lead rescuer looked over at Floyd, paused, turned up, and simply said, "Dead." It turned out that shortly after the cave-in sealed Floyd inside Sand Cave, rocks began to tumble loose again. Over the course of the next couple of days, those rocks struck him repeatedly. Eventually, unawares, several hit him in the head or chest and killed him. Just imagine, you're trapped in total darkness, completely entombed, and every now and then rocks just start falling on you. Who knows how long it took for the final blow? But it had to be one of the most agonizing ways to die. Shortly before the cave-in, a photographer had taken a picture of Floyd. At the time, Floyd believed he was going to make it out. All the rescuers believed they were going to get him out. But not long after that picture was taken, the cave-in sealed his fate. Floyd's body was eventually removed from Sand Cave. However, instead of being buried, the public fascination with the failed rescue led to a disturbing decision. Floyd's body was put on display inside another cave. Essentially, he became a tourist attraction. His remains would stay on display for decades until finally he was removed and given a proper burial.